Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're talking about growing risks for NATO's Article 5 as a cornerstone of the post-World War II global geopolitical order. Uh, there's the upcoming American elections, obviously, which has stirred a lot of controversy around the future of NATO, especially if there's a Trump presidency, but also a more galvanized European alliance around NATO, especially to sort of respond to the threat of Russia and to come to the aid of Ukraine. So a lot to unpack here, but before we go into the details of what's happened recently, Brunello, could you start by giving us some more context around how NATO came about, what its sort of fundamental ideals were, and how much of them still remain now?
Sure. Um, that's interesting because, of course, there's lots of discussion um, on NATO, the future of NATO, what NATO should do, whether we should have a new NATO in the Pacific, and so on. But before even doing that, let's go back to what NATO was. At the end of World War II, there were a number of conferences in Tehran, in Bretton Woods, in Yalta, and Potsdam that put the basis for the post-War II, World War II global, both geopolitical and economic equilibrium. From a security side, there was the first treaty of mutual assistance between France and the UK signed in 47 in Dunkirk. And in 48, the key Western Union treaty was signed in Brussels between, again, France and the UK with the Benelux, so Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It's the embryo of NATO because the Brussels Treaty said that this mutual military assistance should last for 50 years. And, should be not just military, but then there should be cooperation also on economic, social, cultural spheres, and so on. As this treaty unfolded, then negotiation proceeded to have the US and other countries joining this sort of mutual assistance programs. And this is when, in April 49, the NATO was born, NATO as North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What was the difference between the Western Union and NATO? Well, effectively the fact that Canada and, of course, especially the US joined the five European countries together with other European countries such as Italy, Denmark, and so on and so forth. Okay, it's interesting because the embryo of NATO is in fact in Europe. The mastermind out of this group was Ernest Bevin, the UK Foreign Secretary, and um, the headquarters of the organization were and still are in Brussels. So, point is, NATO, in fact, in spite of having the US as by far the dominant force there, is in fact originally a European organization, uh, which means that effectively threat that the US sometimes make on leaving NATO, if really wanted to be implemented, could be could be a credible one, let's say.
Yeah. And then you sort of use that background in your views letter this week to make two key assertions about what may come in the next few months. Tell me more about sort of those two propositions.
So the first one is about the fact that the cornerstone of global security equilibria is Article 5 of NATO, which has an explicit and I would say an implicit leg. The explicit leg is about the actual constituents of and members of NATO. So every country under attack, external attack, would be supported by all the others. So effectively, an attack on any NATO country triggers the response from all the others. And let's be clear, mostly the US is nuclear weapons. That's the explicit one. The implicit one is the Article 5, let's call it that way, granted by the US, to Taiwan. So the US officially recognizes the One China policy, but on the other hand, tells China that if they were to invade Taiwan, they will militarily intervene. Hence, there are all the war games trying to see what will happen if this would really trigger and this. So that is the first point that effectively is absolutely key to remain credible, because if it's not credible, effectively all the countries out there that are threatening the global security architecture as we have known for the last 70, 80 years, such as China, Russia, will have their way. If NATO cannot credibly make sure that Ukraine remains within the sphere, well, let's say, certainly outside the sphere of influence of Russia, well, let's see whether it's going to become part of the sphere of influence of Western countries. Well, it's going to be very hard for the US to actually make the credible threat that if China wants to invade Taiwan, they would be there for them. So the credibility of Article 5, even more than his own existence, is really the cornerstone of the global security architecture as we know it.
And then to come to your second assertion, to sort of look directly at the credibility of Article 5, there's questions around the United States and what might happen if it decides not to defend a fellow NATO ally. How realistic is that, and what could trigger that?
Yeah, so not to defend is like Article 5 is not credible, but then they make it an additional point. This is, oh, you know what? If other countries don't contribute, we may leave NATO. Is it credible? As the history of NATO shows, actually, from a legal standpoint, it's credible. The US may leave NATO, and NATO in theory will still exist with Canada in it, so it would still be North Atlantic. But guess what? Would be totally ineffective. Because the US spends as much as the next 10 largest spending countries in military equipment and defense put together. We're talking about now around 900 billions a year in defense, and this is more than 10 next military spenders combined, including China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia. So, you know, we are talking about an absolutely dominant position in that. So if the US were to leave NATO, NATO would de facto, even if not legally, disappear.
Yeah. Still much to think about, given that, again, the only threats aren't just Russia, Ukraine, as it seems contemporarily, but also long-term. These alliances are planning for 5-10 years ahead, when many of the newer threats might emerge from, the sort of China-Taiwan scenario of escalation, but also elsewhere in the Middle East. So quite a bit to think about as we, test the robustness of an organization that not too long ago, European allies themselves were calling brain dead, that's now been galvanized. So as always, Brunello, thanks so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.